welcome to all of our viewers and listeners to another episode of Together on Mission, a podcast of the Anglican Diocese of All Nations. With me today, as my co-host, is none other than the Venerable Isaac Rayberg, who is the Archdeacon for Liturgy in our diocese and the Rector of All Saints in San Antonio. And Father Laolu and Father Paul Van Allen are with us, both of them planting Hope of Nations in Pflugerville, Texas, just north of Austin. Gentlemen, welcome to the podcast.
Good to be here. Yeah.
Well, as our neighbor to the north, because Venerable Rayberg and I are in the San Antonio area, what can you tell us about how you guys met and how you guys began to discern a call to plant together?
Yeah, I mean, maybe I'll start here because there was a conversation that happened in the spring of 2023, I believe it was, in College Station with a priest who is in the Diocese of Fort Worth. And it happened that I was there for a thing with my kids, and I had been working on a vision for a church plant. And it wasn't that I was like necessarily planning to execute on it, but something was like growing inside of me and I had to like put it on paper. So I was building out this Google Doc of what, if I took all the pieces of Anglicanism that I, felt drawn to and put them together in a combo, what would that be? And so that was sort of a work in progress. And I sat with Father Greg there at Incarnation in College Station. Had a couple of, in fact, my brother knew him, and so did another friend. And we really hit it off. In fact, we had both been at Dallas Seminary at the same time, and so it was really great to have somebody who had sort of shared some of my, like evangelical credentials. We didn't know each other from Dallas Seminary. I think we had some classes together, but we didn't know each other. So anyway, one of the things that I said to him was that, I really want sort of a Bible thumping Anglican church, a John Stott, J.C. Ryle Anglican church. But the other big ingredient would be to have a real embrace of the global nature of Anglicanism. And I really see that as one of the real strengths. So I and my family lived over in China for more than 10 years. I've lived for a spell in Indonesia, Egypt, Thailand, Malaysia, and really value the presence of the Spirit and just what the global church brings, and especially in the current urban moment. I'm in Pflugerville, but I'm about 500 feet from Austin, and Austin's one of these places that's just urban deconstruction is swarming people's faith and raising teenagers in this place, and watching a lot of people, even inside the Anglican Church, lose like their, grounding, or lose their faith, or lose their gender identity, or their marriages and things. I began to really long for some safeguards, and I really expressed that to Greg, and I say that because it was a couple months later that Father Greg reached out to me and said, "Paul, you have to meet somebody." And he put me in touch with Father Laolu. And anyway, the rest is sort of history, but we were able to meet. And I think from the very beginning, it was like as close to a first date where you're going to get married, and you're trying not to say it. It was like, oh, they it also had a vision to plant a church in North Austin, and we really hit it off. We were seeing things, in very similar ways, but also, very different ways in a lot of ways. We can talk about that too. I see a lot of the strength is not just that we read every Bible verse from the same angle, but that we have natural ways of seeing things somewhat differently.
Yeah.
Laolu, what would you add to that from your side?
Let me fill in the other missing gap from my end. So we had moved to College Station in 2021. My wife was enrolled in the PhD program there, and of course we've been Anglican I've been Anglican all my life. We got married, and then we got ordained in 2022. Up until that time, I'd not attended an Anglican church in the US. My first stint with anything Anglican in the US was at the Episcopal Cathedral of Michigan. And what I saw scared me. So I just pulled out, like, okay, no, I'm not going to do this. So fast forward 2022, we got ordained into ministry, became a deacon, the old Anglican Diocese of the West, Anglican Diocese of the Trinity. And then I moved to the West with Bishop Oji, and then I got ordained into the priesthood. We were still in College Station. Now I was a full-fledged priest. And I just knew that I needed to get started with this ministry. The story of my call to ministry, how I discerned, story for another day. Anyway, I told the bishop that I needed to start going to an Anglican church in town here in College Station. And the closest, I just Googled, it was the Church of the Incarnation. Started out some 8 years before that time. They were helping to supervise the Anglican Aggies. And so I walked up to church that Sunday in June of 2022, and I introduced myself to Father Greg. And the way he received me, I knew something had happened to him prior to that time. Eventually, he told me that it was just 2 weeks earlier that he had attended a conference on international ministries, and he was genuinely praying that, God, would you open us to international ministries? We have a church in a university as big as Texas A&M. There are loads of international students, but we don't have any. And he's been praying. And 2 weeks later, this young man walked in, introduced himself as a priest in the Anglican Church, and it was like, wow, God, are you up to something here? So it got me in, spoke to the bishop, and then I started at Church of the Incarnation as a curate, sort of unofficial curate. And so I would go in there, and I would serve on Sundays. All of that time as well, we had started a fellowship of international graduate students, we call it, on campus. And the goal was to help international graduate students. There are a lot of ministries that caters to the needs of locals, Americans, but not so many, that really meets the needs of international. So we had started that, I think, a year before, and that was quite flourishing. And people would tell me, oh, Laolu, you have such a good, sizable number of people. Okay, this can translate into a church in town. Every time people say that, I just didn't sense that that was what God was asking us to do. I have my other job. I'm bivocational, and my other job is in Austin. Every time I drive to Austin, though, and I go through Highway 21 and I see all of this massive land space, I just get drawn to Austin, particularly the northern part of Austin, that this is the kind of places we can do ministry. I don't know any of those places, but that was happening with me. So on one of those one-on-ones with Father Greg, I told him that I feel called and drawn to planting a church in the northern part of Austin. And that was when he told me, interesting. About 3 months ago, I met this amazing person you need to meet, Paul Van Allen, and he connected me with Paul. And it was just that one meet up with Paul. It just seemed like, okay, this is God orchestrating all of this conversation. This is God orchestrating. The hand of God was very clear in the way we had met. And, he had shared his passion. I had shared my passion to coming into the US. As at that time, I was only 4 years into the US. And and that was the seed. It was that one meeting, and what we have today, the Hope of Nations, started.
Amen. So it's wonderful how the Holy Spirit brought the two of you together. Both of you are married with children now. So how is that working as you're planting together with the families?
Yeah, I honestly, having, I have 4 children. My oldest is about to graduate from high school. A daughter named Ava, and then all the way down to 7. And the 2 in the middle are special needs kids, which is a big part of my family's story, and kind of how we ended up coming home from China. But one of things that happened over 2022, I think it was mostly in 2022, was as we were watching the disintegration of teenagers, Christian teenagers around our daughter. And even in Christian contexts, a Christian school that depending on how you looked at it was great. There's Psalms on the walls and it's all this great thing, but they were intentionally you making space for an uncommitted view on pressing questions on the human body and gender and sexuality, and that space that was being created. One of my feelings on that issue is like, you cannot keep a vacuum when there is that much air pressure on an issue. Um, and so that space began to fill up very quickly with heterodox teaching and thinking, not necessarily, teaching in a, explicit way from the teachers, and certainly not all of the teachers were like that, but the student body. So that very quickly, my daughter at a Christian school was a sexual minority as a cisgendered female, Christian. And actually had her best friends, one at that time and one just recently. Her two best friends have like basically canceled their friendship with her, because not because she said anything, but because her views have not evolved. And so, you know, this is part of what has animated me is seeing canaries in the coal mine of Austin sort of like go down, and being like, wow, this is amazing. This is you know, just shocking and should be alarming. Well, I would just say that that has been one of the most beautiful things about how this would work out, how this has worked out. I think one of the things when you talk to people that do church plants or house church, and we're still like kind of like a large house church right now, we're probably right on the verge of needing to find other space. But that what about teens? What about your teenagers? And I would just say, man, this has been the most fruitful thing about this for me as a dad, is to have my daughter not only there where we are really wrestling and taking the scripture seriously, we have liturgy and Eucharist, but we have voices from around the globe in our community, including Father Laolu and his wife Ife. And I'll just give one, story of how real that is. Now, some of this is afforded by our pedagogy is very Socratic. So we, rather than homilies that have been prepared and wordsmithed, we do sort of like what, if you've heard of a Discovery Bible study, but like sort of an Anglican on steroids thing, where we have both deeply engaged the text and we hybrid teach in an engaged way, where we ask what people are seeing and like what are their thoughts, and sometimes there needs to be a correction or something in that, but also what can emerge from that is unbelievable testimony. So I remember we were in the lectionary readings were around giving back in 2024, and there was the 2 Corinthians 9 passage about how God will if as you are practicing the exercise of giving, God will provide all of your needs. And then Ife spoke up in a very sort of soft way and just said, yeah, I remember reading that when I was a little girl. And um, and so I just decided, every morning I got my 2 coins, one for riding the bus to school and one for riding the bus back. And so I would get on the bus with my 1 coin and say, I'm going to give the other one away. And then I'm going to see if God can get me home. And every day, a miracle happened to get me home. Wow. And to have my daughter sitting there and go and just absorbing, and she's become very close with one of the Ghanaian sisters. They're both in a discipleship group with another Ghanaian lady. And, to have Uncle Tom and Brenda, who lived their whole life in South America, to have these, multi-generational, multicultural, and voices from the edge of really trusting in God and God's scripture, his word having, like I would say, purchase on the lives of the people. So for my daughter to be able to experience that and the strength that I've seen emerge in her, like I wouldn't trade that for anything. And so I feel like I've sort of somehow been able to get my cake and eat it too, or whatever, keep it and eat it, because I'm having the church I want to go to the ministry that I want to have, and seeing my family be deeply blessed. Laolu and Ife have spent the night in our home many times, and other people from the church, and that just rich community is really something I wouldn't trade for anything.
Now, Laolu, you were telling us before we recorded that your little one is about 3 months old now. Is that your first
Yes,
little
that's
one?
our first and only child as at now. We started this business pretty late. Myself and my wife got married in our mid 30s.
That's how my wife and I were too. So yeah.
And it took us a while to even have this first one. So when I came into the US in 2018, I came into business school. And one of the things that uh, really was a concern for me coming in was, question in my heart, Lord, how are we going to raise kids in a culture like this? The beautiful thing about Africa, where we grew up, is we're very communal. So, so you're coming from school, you're walking from school, and you're just playing with your friend, and you're just messing around. Some total stranger who's in his house, in the front of his house, is yelling at you and telling you, you can't do that, stop that. So we're just so communal, and everybody's in everybody's business, and then you have a church community that is just so beautiful that even if your family is not such a very Christian family, there's a lot of input from the community, from the church, that somehow just helps you to, to just turn out right. That's not what it is here. The US is very individualistic. You probably live in a community, and for 2 years, you don't even know your neighbors. So, and of course, with social media and all that's happening, that was a real concern for me, Lord. God, how would we raise kids here? And I remember strongly that one of the things that came strongly to me is that there are people doing that well, who are very successful raising their kids. You just need to find such community and be planted. So so that became a very a driving force for me. It must be a community of people who think like me, who share the same ideals and values. So, of course, we thought babies would come in early. It took a while, and it's turning out really great, because by the time Ebon, our baby, who is 3 months and 2 weeks now, by the time I mean, we prayed her to be. I remember this community when we started out our Monday meetings. Every Monday was a prayer point. The whole community would pray and say, Lord, these guys are waiting on you. You must make this happen. And right there, God blessed us, and this baby came. It was born into this church. We dedicated our sometime in March. So the privilege of growing up in a community like this is just amazing. And our church, we've got a lot of kids who come around every now and then, and just trusting God that we will be intentional and do well with kids, because I also see that a lot of focus goes on the grown-ups, the adults. Those are some of the things Paul and I share.
There's a widow from Burma who is working with our kids, and
Yes.
she is just a deep woman of the Lord. And I would just say, like, I mean this in the best of way, and in some ways, Lalu as well, but like refreshingly old school, just like, here's the gospel, and just like bringing that to our kids and kids that come to our fellowship. I'd also say my other role in ministry is as a missions leader with an organization called Pioneers. I'm global missions. And right now oversee a lot of our ministries in the U.S. among diaspora unreached people groups, but also with some work among diaspora migrant communities that are Christian. And I'm aware that there's sometimes a crisis for the second generation migrants around integrating their faith in their identity, because they basically are dual identity as potentially Nigerian or Ghanaian or some Chinese, and yet when they go to church, when they go to sort of ethnically homogenous church, from that first generation, led by first generation, that's very rich for them in some ways, but there's a lot of times a gap then in them being able to integrate that into their Monday through Saturday identity.
Yeah.
And so, and not to say that like the only solution to that is like to do a model like what we're doing, but it's one way to say, look, we're intentionally going to be a third cultured space. And to some degree, the Americans in the room who are, just naturally more American in their culture. And as that sort of blended together into a hybrid, I think it will create a pathway for second generation migrants, to incarnate their faith into like their entire life more. And yeah, if that makes sense.
Now, I visited your church, guys, about a year ago, and I just was delighted. It was a wonderful feel. The people were wonderful. The worship was wonderful. Um, the Hope of Nations is the name. How many nations do you have represented right now just in your parish?
Well, we're really small still. We're fitting in the room right behind me here. I would just let's see. With migrants, sometimes there's coming and going, right? So right now there's 3 African families from 3 different countries, and then there's a number of and then Burma or Myanmar, and then there's a number of Caucasian families, but who are themselves third cultured people. So lots of people, like a family that lived in South Asia for many years. We lived in China. Tom and Brenda. Tom is Hispanic and was born in Ecuador and sat in Jim Elliot's lap when he was a little boy and right there and so these different parts of the world are represented. But we've had people from many other nations who are they're sort of like those that come regularly. We also have non-believers. One guy who's on the verge of being a brother. Actually, he just kind of confessed pretty much faith to me, and yet he's like, don't get too excited. I'm not ready to get baptized, But he's was raised by a Turkish father and a Colombian mother, but because of the Catholic Islamic sort of pressure there, they tried to create the like agnostic atheist vacuum for him, and that's what he's finding his way out of. So other Hispanics, and we've had Ukrainians and people from all over the place. So I think that there's still a lot of I say work to be done, but it's really we are just ready for the Lord to do whatever he wants to do.
And there was this Sunday, Paul was getting ready to get our liturgy on ChatGPT to translate it to Arabic because we were expecting some Iraqi family that.
Yes, there's some Iraqis that are in. So there's a lot of people that sort of orbit around our community, and we don't use email in our community. We use WhatsApp. WhatsApp is like I'm sure everybody has it, but especially among diaspora peoples, migrant peoples, and around the world, WhatsApp is sort of your all included communication tool. And so it's easy for people to join that and for us to do prayer requests, share verses and, thoughts, or I'll throw YouTube videos out there that I think would be edifying during the week or whatever. And so, that's sort of this like broader ring of people that are being, added, regularly.
Yeah, it's certainly something we've seen in our diocese that took a while at least for me to wrap my mind around. Why does everybody like this platform? Well, because it is such an international platform.
And I was shocked when I got to the US and I talk WhatsApp and people are like, okay, what's that? Like, it's not a thing. Like, okay.
Definitely, I think the average person in the world is using that much more than email, today. So,
yeah, it really didn't become a big thing for me until this diocese, and then obviously when Father Isaac and I do pilgrimages, I mean that's what we're using to communicate back home.
Yeah.
So it's phenomenal that you guys are reaching all these different people groups.
In addition to Aggies in Longhorn Land.
Exactly.
That's almost another nation.
Exactly. That's another topic altogether. But my question, I guess, is how do you reach them? I mean, how are you reaching these different people groups? Because I think that's what people will be really interested to know. How are you fishing for these people? How are you finding them? How are they finding you? So what can you say?
Well, I would just say, at this point, Laolu and Ife are still commuting in from College Station. Ife is supposed to defend her dissertation in next month, actually almost exactly a month from today. And then the plan is for them to move. And so there's been a sense of like, at least not really, I don't know, I've used the language of keeping my foot on the brakes or not putting it on the gas until he gets here, because I've also been like strongly committed to plurality of leadership if possible, and really share leadership, although I'm happy to take responsibility as well, as a leader. But so I would just say we have not done a lot of like actual promoting. It's been more just relational. And of course, people have found us just by having our, it's in my house, but I went ahead and registered it as a church on Google, which I think is how a lot of people find churches that are looking for them.
Yeah.
And so that, and then just, just relationally in the world, inviting people. And I would say, like, from the mission side of my my identity in life, there is a certain bad rap that has come on what they call the invitational model of just inviting people into church. And I think, my pendulum is sort of corrected back to seeing real value in an invitational model, that people would be invited into a place of life and home and relationship, and not, now not everybody is ready to do that, but that, hey, anytime you'll hear, if you hang out in international student ministry or with immigrant peoples, these people often for 4 years never get invited to church. And I'm like, well, I just invited that person, and gave them my business card and said, hey, I would love for you to come. Right behind my house, off, if I just tilted my camera this way, is a charter school that is 85% Indian, and it's probably 3% Caucasian. And there's people from Turkmenistan and Uzbekistan, and I'm inviting them. And there is something beautiful about just being invited to church.
Yeah.
And so that's an unsophisticated answer. We finally spent a little money on some of those yard signs and put some in the front yard. So that's our media campaign so far.
All right.
Yeah, and hopefully when we get back to Georgetown, we can be a lot more aggressive. Saturday in the evenings, we'll go out in the neighborhood to talk to the people. Probably print out some things and send out in the mail, so that, because usually it's somebody just wants to go to a church someday and they remember that, oh, somebody invited me at some point. Oh, there was this guy I met on the bus. There was this guy I met at the coffee shop,
Right.
So just being out there talking.
Wonderful. So, Paul, you said something earlier about you've been meeting in the space behind you, and that you're almost at that point to go to a different space. So, how do you discern that for planters? How does a community discern that, hey, the space no longer is fitting us, we need to step out?
I think, I don't think that I have like an official answer to that. I think there's just going to be a place time when what I've heard is like, when you get to X percentage capacity, people don't come anymore. I don't know that I swallow, anything as normative in that sense of like some percentage or whatever, but it's really like when it's like, hey, we can do more ministry if we had more chairs, and so, and I think the real question for us is going to be, what does the model of how we are doing Anglican worship, especially with our engagement with scriptures, how does that survive getting bigger? Or do we commit to some sort of, we've really only begun to dream, and we haven't even really done much, but it's like, hey, we love the intimacy, because it's like, one of the ways I put it is, this is more like a laboratory, like a class that you would take, is the way that I see church, that you come together to work out your salvation with fear and trembling in community, in real life situations. It's not, me going to lecture you and you take notes. Let's work this out. That, of course, could own, like that Socratic method is limited if you have, one microphone and all that. So we'll see. I mean, one of the things that, is this again is just like, I remember something that a conversation we had a long time ago. It was like, well, what if instead of buying like a normal church building, we bought, we're right on the outside all the zoned areas here of Austin, like what if we found an acre with some house on it that we just turned in, and there were different nations and different peoples and just hospitable to the nations around us. And there were things like this. Maybe we have 3 or 4 Anglican services on different evenings and different days and different Bible studies and things. But it was, these laboratories are increasing, And so I don't know if that's reality, but it was at least captures, I think, part of the heart is that we would by hook and crook not lose the ability to really see every man and woman fully mature in Christ. That we, of course, I believe the liturgy is hugely helpful, and it's very powerful to center our service in the Eucharist, but also being able to really engage. So, yeah.
Well, what does liturgy and worship look like in the context y'all have? Y'all have a very unique context. Yeah.
Laolu, I did a lot of talking. Why don't you talk?
Yeah. Liturgy in our context has been very unique because if you come to a typical Sunday service, it's a bit of the 2019 Book of Common Prayers, a bit of the Kenyan Rite. I think we have a bit of the Nigerian Rite as well.
But we did. We've sort of switched back to just 2019, but we have that on yeah.
So when we started out, it was a bit of that, but we've also kept it also light because the kind of people we're trying to reach the people group. These are people who probably are very new to Anglicanism. They've never experienced a liturgical worship, and so we've kept it really light. And one of the things Paul also does very well is he tries to explain every bit, why, what does the Kyrie means, for instance, why do we say what we say? Why do we have the candles on? And every now and then, if we have a new person, would explain it. And very recently, we also know that because this is an Anglican church and we want people to grow in the appreciation of the liturgy, and that was what I was referring to. We started, adding piece by piece to it. We don't want to, overwhelm our people. We're just having the full rite, and people are wondering what's happening here. So bit by bit, we're adding to it, and we see how long we can do this for.
Yeah. There's something interesting I read. This just kind of came to mind the other day. In the 1660s, right after the English Civil War, when liturgy had been abolished for a while under the Puritans, the wise rectors were only introducing it over a period of like 5 years, little by little, getting their people used to, even though it was the law of the land to do it, they were like, we're going to ease into this so that we don't cause more problems.
Yeah. I do a lot of my personal devotions are centered around scripture memory, and this is part of the same last couple of years of, trying to counteract against the drift. And so I try to find a verse in every chapter of the Bible that becomes kind of a peg verse for me. And so Ecclesiastes 6 has this verse that says, "The more the words, the less the meaning." And how does that help anyone? And I think, and I think what I would just say is that like all of us have different tolerances for words and have grown in appreciation, and so we are adding words and we're growing that. And that's been, and I think because I don't come out of a liturgical background, I found Anglicanism about 10 years ago when we came home from China, and it was sort of a process of elimination in my life. And then it got to like a real appreciation. But I'm very conscious of what that person is. That is really the majority of our community.
Yeah. Well, Hope of Nations, it's a beautiful name. It's a beautiful community. When I think about different nations coming together and different cultures coming together, there's 2 things I primarily think of, and that is food and music. And so can you guys share, how does that come out in the life of your community?
So when we started out in 2023, August of 2023, we were meeting Monday evenings for food and the word. So that was how we sold it. We invite people to come for dinner on Monday night and for the word. So, uh, and we did that for close to 9 months, from August till about
Probably 8 months, yeah, into
about
March,
8 months.
Easter
Easter
Sunday
on
of
2024, yes.
2024.
So food and okay, on Sundays too, okay, there's always food. There's bagel. Lisa does an amazing job providing food every week for us. We
Yeah,
don't eat to church. We
But
invite people to
but
come
do you
on.
guys have like food
yeah.
from the different nations represented when you guys do potlucks and
Like,
things like that?
so we had a feast, not this last Sunday, we had Easter Sunday and then also the next Sunday. And, the Indian kids and the different nations that are at the school, they had a food fair the day before. And so I was going around just like, I'm spending money here and I'm eating all these kids' food. And then I came across some Indian dish that I could find it because he's the guy sitting to me, but I was like, can you make a bunch of these for me for church tomorrow? And so he brought these. They were like sandwiches and they were unbelievable.
Yeah.
They were vegan, but we obviously have African food and, as you know, and just whenever there's a covered dish supper, it's great. And, as Pentecost approaches, we'll definitely be doing another, all nations food event and, get to eating all that stuff. So my family loves food from everywhere.
Yeah. Well, it's such an important part of mission, looking, especially if you're going to do things cross-culturally, just the simple things, food and music. Like at my home parish in San Antonio this last weekend, we had a baptism, and so we had a lot of Nigerian families in town, and there's probably 50 Nigerians at my church this last Sunday.
Awesome.
And we knew that they were coming, and we also have about 5 or 6 Nigerian families that are just members of our parish, and so we closed out the service with an African song, and to have everyone dancing up and down the aisle, it was really a special, life-giving moment. And and we have special feasts like that, what you just mentioned, Paul. And my home parish, we have Hispanics, we have Anglos, we have African people there, and so it's a fun thing to come together and to have a meal together. It's all delicious. In fact, I was just reminded of that because after the church service this last Sunday, I had to go to a reception, which was at someone's house, and I've been on keto for about 2 months. Right. And of course, I'm going and visiting in the house, and all of a sudden, all from like everywhere, this food is just put before me, and I had to make a decision.
Yeah.
Do I eat this or
Yeah.
do I not? Now I love all the food, but I've been trying to be healthy, and
Yeah.
I it was amazing because as I'm eating, I had all these amazing conversations about mission and ministry. And so I think that's something special that happens when you're thinking about, okay, how does food bring us together as Christians, and how food brings us together for mission, and how even music
Yeah.
opens doors.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, as you were talking about your parish, Bishop Seeley, I was thinking, Three Streams Anglican Church. I've been thinking about one-upping you and naming this church Four Streams Anglican Church. Because I honestly, I like to think of it this way that, so in Three Streams, you have sort of that evangelical, like Bible centered, you have the liturgical Catholic, and then you have that Pentecostal spirit, coming together. Well, one for me, this is just I see that Bible part as a river with some tributaries coming into it, but one of the tributaries is this fourth stream, which is the global church. And I think that, if we're not, moving towards that, then we are, impoverishing ourselves. And then I would just say specifically and would be for, urban American, colleagues and laity to hear, but like in a place where we're connected to the internet, we're in an urban place, we are being deformed so quickly and so constantly. And I think about so much of, like, when the scriptures talk about the world, the flesh and the devil, that these are very environmental almost. They're like they're cultural, and there's these forces that are forming you when you're not conscious of it. Every advertisement that you see, but it becomes a sort of environmental hazard, similar to, like, an illustration would be like the water in Flint, Michigan, that's just coming through the pipes. And it's like, this is what we are drinking. We are not even able to fully remove ourselves from it, though we can do things, turn the TV off and put the phone down and things like that. But it's just coming at us, and it's also because it's also the flesh, and even if I'm not, watching that, like you might be, and there's this infection process. But I think that part of the way that, the pneumatology that I see of the gifts being given in each person coming and bringing when we gather, and you can see multinationalism from the very first, breath of the church in Acts 2. I mean, it's a multilingual, multicultural moment. It's an explosion of God's Spirit into the world. And now we sit in a time when, I really believe that, the Western Church has, one of our most practical hopes. Our actual hope, capital H, is in God Himself, but practically the lifeline that He's throwing is the potential for revitalization through, giving that front seat and that microphone to voices of people that are coming from the global South, from the majority world. Not to say that just hand it out without, like, not everyone is, just because they're coming from another country doesn't, is somehow, qualified to teach or something like that. But I think it's a countermeasure, and it gives me real hope for the American church.
Yes, I'm reminded, C.S. Lewis talks about, the reason why he advocates old books is because they expose us to our prejudices, right? We see our blind spots through their eyes. And the same has got to be true when we're going multinational and global. It exposes our own blind spots. And so it's like, if old books is the vertical, then this is the horizontal.
100% agree with that.
And it's the intentionality here that counts. When I came in here, I just saw that it's not very many churches, not very many congregations. And it becomes more difficult when you're a very established church, when you're established in a certain way. To now start and do these things that we're talking about becomes all the more difficult. So it would take a lot of intentionality from the leaders of the church, the pastors, to make this happen, if we will say it.
Yeah, that's one of the beauties of church planting. That, I mean, our church is 50 years old. We don't get to do some of the kinds of things that y'all as planters do, and it's really exciting to see. I mean, there's always trade-offs either way, right? But the kinds of nimbleness that y'all have as a plant to experiment with these types of things and put these ideas into practice that maybe haven't been thought of before but should have been thought of before is a really beautiful thing to watch.
I would also say, one of the things that I've experienced, this is a little bit outside the multicultural question, but like just in church planting as an Anglican house church, I was not able to, when I first was thinking about this, I was not able to find a whole lot in the internet about Anglican house churches. I mean, I think there's some, but it's not, but I actually think that it works quite well because, all of the energy that goes into preparing Sunday morning, in all of the different roles hats that a church planter has to wear, to have a liturgy deck that's sort of set, and that it does the heavy lifting for you, and it really frames, our time. And I think Laolu mentioned this before. There's a lot of, I see every Sunday as like an instructed Eucharist. It's like it's just different times and places because it is more casual. So anyway, for anybody who is out there, maybe not an Anglican and thinking about church planting, come on in. And this is, the water's great, and it's an interesting way to plant church.
We've got good tools. We've got really good tools.
Amen to that.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, gentlemen, so much for your time. I really want to commend you again for how you're planting cross-culturally. It's such an inspiration to us, and it's something that we really wanted to highlight across the diocese. To all of our viewers, thank you for listening and watching, and join us next time on Together on Mission.